Please. Well, it's Father's Day today in the commercial world, and so an excuse to be greater consumers, I think. But it's meant to be that we show respect for our fathers on this occasion, and we acknowledge their work, their support, but it's also a message to fathers themselves that we are responsible to perform our responsibilities as well. And I pray and give thanks for fathers and grandfathers and great-grandfathers, if there are any here, or online. Because today we're focusing on how we live out responsibilities in a more general way. In the season of creation, we look or we think about how we've husbanded the environment, the planet, how we've cared for it, and where we've fallen short. We need to acknowledge that and take appropriate action. If we look at our scripture readings today, the first reading is about a potter. That's Jeremiah, and Jeremiah walked into a potter's studio, I suppose we'd say, and saw a potter there making a very delicate object, maybe a vase, maybe an urn, we don't know. And as he was forming it and shaping it, it sort of went wrong. It got distorted. It was bent or something, and so he changed his mind and he'd make something else. Another useful ornament or utility, I suppose, but it was reshaped in the process. Feels like us, doesn't it? We get reshaped from time to time as we live our lives and go a bit astray, or we get a bit slack, or we forget about God, we get our focus that is not God's focus on things. And that could be a father, it could be just a member of the community or a member of the community of any age, as we care for the environment in which we live. And in that story, it reminds us that when something is being shaped by a potter, the image in the mind is perfection, to get exactly how they want it. But sometimes things intervene, and then that change has to be made. The temptation is to get utterly frustrated, turn it back into a ball of clay and throw it in the corner or something. Very human response, and I'm sure some potters do that. But God doesn't do that with us, thankfully. We don't get tossed on the dung heap or whatever. God comes to reshape us. In our second reading, we see it in a human perspective. It's one of the few times where we get to read a whole book of the Bible. Philemon is just one letter, 25 verses, where Paul, who is in jail, has met an escaped slave, Onesimus. Onesimus has responded to the gospel. And Paul's sending Onesimus back to where he came from. And sending him back to with a letter to Philemon, to the whole household where a Christian community meets, and they're very good at proclaiming the gospel. But sometimes people don't have a very good attitude towards escaped slaves that come back. And the tendency could very well be to get retribution for running away. Maybe it's implied in the letter that he might have stolen something and taken it with him when Onesimus escaped. Provisions for the way, maybe something more valuable, we don't know. But Paul writes to value Onesimus, returning him not just as a slave, but as more than a slave. Because he is now a witness to God's love, to God's care. And he sends him back to be part of that community, but not just part of that community, but to take Paul's love back to that community. And be, in a sense, Paul's representative back into that house that Paul had established and encouraged in the early days, but now he's in jail for Christ. But Onesimus is being released and sent back with Paul's love. And he thanks the household for the prayers that they've had for him. And he says, well, make up the guest room. I hope to come and join you soon. Restoration. We're reminded in these scriptures as we look at our attitude to creation, and we're encouraged in this season of this year, the focus for creation is to hear creation talking to us, to experience it. Don't know if you read my reflection in Focus that went out recently, but I like lying in bed in the morning when I don't have to get up early and come anywhere or go anywhere, and just listen to the birds outside. And at the moment I think there's some young birds in the trees because they're very gentle sort of sounds. And just to lie there and welcome the day. Well, appreciate the life around us, the natural life. Because it's even better when I get away camping or bushwalking and you hear that morning chorus in the bush as the various birds and animals start moving. But we don't only hear creation through our ears. We hear it as we just sense the landscape being devastated, or the landscape that's looking beautiful and glorious, and the rains have come and it's not in drought and the rivers are flowing rather than dried up, and the land speaks to us. Obviously, if you're a grazier or a farmer, it might speak a bit more loudly. Wow, we've got some water in the dam. But grass is going to come soon to feed the stock or to grow the plants. But sometimes, of course, too much rain comes, and all those up around Gatton and that are just recovering from the fields being washed out in the floods. How do we look at that? Well, science tells us that it's our problem. We're causing it. We all know that the globe is warming up. We all know that as it warms, storms become more ferocious, more prevalent. We keep trying to engineer to avoid flooding, but it just doesn't work because we don't listen to creation. If you look at the Brisbane River, back in the early settlement, they had a big flood, so they built the Somerset Dam to hold it back. But they kept building on the floodplain. And then they had another big flood, so they built the Wynnum Dam to protect a bit more of the floodplain. Then, of course, as we know, in 74, 2011, and even this year, we still get flooding because we are not living in harmony with creation. We're trying to beat it into the way we want it to be. But that's not God's way. As the potter was moulding that clay, he was taking what was there and shaping it and understanding it and going with it. But when we go outside the norms and think we know better, then we get ourselves into trouble. The natural order needs to be in balance and in harmony. And we as human beings are given greater responsibility because God has given us creative power. He's given us the skills for engineering and understanding how the environment works and that. But if we only use it for our own benefit and we forget about the habitat for all the other animals and creatures, if we want to squeeze it for the last drop that we can get out of it, if we want to burn all the fossil fuels, which is the solar energy that landed on this planet in the time of dinosaurs, and release that on top of the energy that's coming in today, we're beginning to understand that we're overheating the planet. We're wiping out species. We're destroying habitat. Because God has given us free will. We are not robots that have to just do the right thing. Animals might work that way, but we are given free will, the power to choose, the power to use our abilities for good or for evil, to use it responsibly or to use it irresponsibly. But there are consequences, and the Bible readings today remind us of those responsibilities. That if we follow the ways of God, if we understand creation as God has enabled us to understand it, and we learn how we can live in harmony with it, our Indigenous brothers and sisters have done that on this continent for thousands of years. And they had very little impact on the environment. Yes, they moulded it to some extent, but it was within reason. Our society was doing that quite well up until about the 1970s, when it became obvious that we'd overstepped the mark. In 1970s, it's estimated that the amount of resources we took from the planet was in harmony with the amount of resource that the planet could regenerate. And science has now worked out what they call the Overshoot day. The day in the year when we've used all the resources that the world can produce in 12 months in that length of time. At the moment, in 1970s, it was about December the 29th or something, almost the end of the year. That's come progressively forward, and at the moment, it's in July. And if everybody lived the way we do here in Australia, the way we use the resources, the date's the 23rd of March, if everybody followed our example. And we're being called to account. And the UN and other people are starting to say, right, we've got to reduce the planet, we've got to reduce our emissions, we've got to reduce greenhouse gases, we've got to reuse, repurpose, recycle, rather than just consume and throw away. And that's the challenge. Are we going to be responsible? We're going to reflect during this season of creation. It goes from the 1st of September to the 4th of October, St. Francis Day. We're going to consider how we are progressing or what we can do about it. And on the last Sunday of Season of Creation, just forget what date it is, but it's early in October, not the 4th, but that's a Wednesday or something. It's the 2nd or 3rd. We have the blessing of pets. When we bless those creatures that we invite into our homes, and they're great companions and useful in other ways, especially if they're guide dogs or companion dogs. But I want us to think at this year, for the blessing of the pets, that we also think of the wild birds and animals in our gardens, and how we can appreciate their presence and care for them. Or we might even want to think about the whales that go up the coast once a year and back down again. Yes, they're not pets in one sense of the world, but they are God's creatures. And so on that Sunday, we will have the blessing of pets. Please don't bring your whale if you've got one. It might be a bit crowded. But other animals that are okay to bring in and you can control are most welcome. If they're a different type of animal or species that you want to remember on that day, bring a photo. And spiritually they'll be present. Let us really celebrate the season of creation as we consider how well we are husbanding our environment and what we can do to reduce our impact. So we hear the voice of all creation as it cries out. I know it was a long collect this morning, but it was reminding us of the processes, and you might find it useful to read through it again at a later date, or listen to the recording of it if you on YouTube or wherever it's stored. God is the potter. We are the clay. We are being moulded the way God wants us to be. And as Christians, we are called to be responsive, but we are also warned that if we are not obedient, if we are not careful, then the consequences not only affect us, but they affect others also, and indeed can affect the whole planet. Amen.